Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another live episode of The Breakdown. It is February 2nd, 2025, the end of the world as we know it. It's all good, though. I think I'm just going to stop saying, hey, you know what I'd really like? I'd like a quiet week in politics, because every time I say that, it gets worse, and I would like it to not. I'm fine if it gets worse, he said, hoping for some reverse psychology with the universe. We have so much to talk about tonight. It has been a crazy busy week, so we're going to get right into it right out of the gates. We've got to start by talking about doing a little bit of follow-up, because we mentioned it last episode, but we didn't really get to get into it. So we got to talk about the Alberta COVID-19 pandemic response final report. And it's fun because it was called a final report when they released it, but then they had to change it a little bit. So let's get right into it. This COVID report was released very quietly on January 24th. This is the report that Smith commissioned. And the report had some problems, to say the least. It called for halting the use of COVID-19 vaccines in healthy children and teenagers, conducting further research into their effectiveness, establishing support for vaccine-injured individuals, and providing an opt-out mechanism from federal public health policy. Now, the report also criticized doctors for practicing evidence-based medicine, which is wild, and taking a restrictive approach to certain drugs, including ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, which is used to treat malaria. They also argued that professional regulatory bodies should be restricted so they wouldn't be able to discipline healthcare workers and physicians who abandoned evidence-based medicine, which would be bad, because it's all about the evidence in the medicine. The report also argued that media is under the thumb of public health. I have not received my public health check, and said the government should require the press to publicly disclose any affiliations when reporting on health-related matters, require media to cite level of supporting evidence, and provide disclosure of any political or financial competing interests that may influence their reporting, including publicly disclosing the dollar value and conditions of their public health and pharmaceutical contracts. And the response to the report has been by people qualified to do so. And we're going to talk about that tonight. We're going to talk about what should the qualifications look like. But by the people who were qualified to do so, the response has been pretty consistent. On January 27th, the Alberta Medical Association issued a statement regarding the report of the Alberta COVID-19 Pandemic Data Review Task Force. And they didn't really pull any punches. This report is anti-science and anti-evidence. It advances misinformation. It speaks against the broadest and most diligent international scientific collaboration and consensus in history. This report sows distrust. It criticizes proven preventative public health measures while advancing fringe approaches. It makes recommendations for the future that have real potential to cause harm. At a time when our hospitals are struggling to stay afloat and patients are waiting for care every hour of every day, the $2 million price tag for this product could have been much better spent. And they're not wrong, because they weren't the only ones who had concerns with the report in a very big way. The Canadian Medical Association also endorsed the Alberta Medical Association's concerns about the report from the Alberta COVID-19 Pandemic Data Review Task Force. Terrible name. This report promotes misinformation and has the potential to create mistrust of the medical and scientific communities. So let's be clear what we're talking about here. This is the Alberta Medical Association, so the professional body that's responsible for making sure that all physicians practice evidence-based medicine, and the Canadian Medical Association, who's responsible for doing the same thing at a national level, all coming out and saying, this thing's hot garbage and it's going to cause real harm, and please stop with it. But it didn't stop there. The Canadian Pediatricians Society also weighed in. And they were very, very clear as well. They wrote a letter on January 31st, writing a letter to the premier that said, "We urge the government of Alberta to disregard this report and to protect and promote evidence-based decision-making while working to prevent the spread of health misinformation and scientific mistrust in Canada." But that's just the beginning of the criticism. That's just the beginning of the problems. I made a little joke at the beginning about how the final version of the report wasn't actually the final version of the report because they had to go in and make some changes. John Conley, a physician and former head of the University of Calgary's medical department, said he was not on Alberta's COVID review panel and never consented to his name being associated with it. But it was initially it was in the bio of the report. So they released a re-released version that updated the bio. At the end of all of the biographies, note the name of Dr. John Connolly was included as one of the contributors in error, and that the Pandemic Data Review Task Force regrets this error, and the name and bio has since been removed. The task force acknowledged that Dr. John Connolly was interviewed on a singular item related to the interpretation of one of the quoted articles. So already, let's just run down the score. We've got the Canadian Medical Association. We've got the Alberta Medical Association. We've got the Canadian Pediatric Association all saying this thing's hot garbage. And they included someone as a contributor to the report who wasn't actually a contributor to the report. And you might think, how could it possibly get worse? It can't possibly get worse than that. And you would be 100% wrong. Because there was also an open letter from a boatload of experts that was published on January 29th. And it was like the body of the letter is really just kind of the first 3.5 pages. The rest of the letter is all experts from across a variety of fields here in Alberta. These are people who read the report, went, "Oh my God, this is a hot garbage pile. We have to do something about this." And they issued the open letter. And it's pretty wild. We're going to go through some of it because it's absolutely worth going through. One of the things that they said in the open letter, there's now a large and diverse body of evidence, including numerous clinical trials that have consistently shown, referring to the hydroxychloroquine ivermectin, that it is not an effective treatment for COVID-19 and that it is associated with potentially harmful side effects. So they've done clinical trials to determine whether or not ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine have any value when it comes to treating COVID-19. And the answer is no. No, they do not. They just don't. So could we stop talking about it, please? But it's the next bit that's really, really fun. Beyond the selection and misrepresentation of the data presented, numerous passages in the report appear to be directly copied from other pre-existing documents. So the report that Albertans paid $2 million for to a bunch of interesting characters appears to have been in part plagiarized, because that's how credible reports work. Some of the references included in the vaccine section are absent, instead simply listed as TBD, presumably to be determined, suggesting the narrative references would be added later to support the narrative. And it's real. And they didn't take it out of the version that they took Dr. John Connolly's name out. How do we know? Because we looked this afternoon. And sure enough, when you go to the report, when you go to the pages that are the references for Chapter 8 under vaccines, citation 241 and 243 are both TBD. So the report that Albertans paid $2 million for comes complete with incomplete references. That's cool, isn't it? Now, just for fun, we checked, and in the spirit of fairness, let's say, we checked the open letter to see if they had, because they had, like I said, when we threw that up, you can find the link on our socials as well. But the last like 3 pages, those are all citations for all of the things that they refer to in this letter. So we checked to see whether or not the open letter had anything that was TBD. The only time that TBD appears in the actual experts letter, the one that was written by experts in public health and virology and all of the other things, the only place it appeared was when they referred to the fact that it appeared in the report. Nowhere else. And it certainly didn't appear in the citation. So again, it's worth noting that the signatories on this letter represent fields of, like, high-end fields of immunology, virology, public health, clinical trials, pediatrics, and a whole lot more. So there is a huge whack of experience, knowledge, education, professionalism, all of the good things that you want to have doctors do. All of that is there in the open letter. And maybe not so much in the original report, but nonetheless, the report does have some support from some, let's go, not surprising sources. A UCP MLA, and it's so fun to play. Let's guess which one. But failed restaurateur, a backer of conspiracy theories, and UCP MLA Eric Bouchard wants to see the report put forward in its entirety. And yes, this is the same Eric Bouchard who hosted in his constituency for the UCP, the non-oncologist convention, the tinfoil hat celebration, the injection of truth, which was bad. It was very bad. There was a lot of things that were said there that simply weren't true, that scientists and doctors, I'm air quoting that for our audio audience, believed that they could say, which brings us to the premier, because of course it does, because she was asked about the report at a press conference that she did on January 29th, same day that this letter was released. Smith was asked for her thoughts.
What do you intend to do with these recommendations now that they are out? Besides reading them is an obvious thing. Mm-hmm. But what are you going to do beyond reading them?
Well, I was pleased to see that we had a broad cross-section of doctors able to look at our previous COVID response, identify processes that were in place, identify things that may have gone wrong, identify things that are now under question, like the efficacy of masks and the efficacy of this vaccine in children. And so I think we're going to take a look at that, and obviously we'll make some decisions about whether to move forward on any of the recommendations. But the point of it was to figure out what we do should there be another pandemic that we have to respond to, so that we don't make mistakes that hurt people. So I was pleased that they came forward with a report. I don't have an agenda yet of what we might implement, but I think we always have to make sure that in a world where we care about science, that all voices are heard. That's what science is. You actually hear the different viewpoints so that you can make solid decisions on what you hear. And I think restoring the right of doctors to be able to speak their minds without punishment from their colleges, I think that's going to be important too. Otherwise, politicians will make bad decisions. So this is the kind of approach you should probably expect from me, that I will always seek out.
Yeah, you want to make sure, it's very important that when you're dealing with politicians, you want to make sure that they're well informed. You want to make sure that they have all of the correct information, because the last thing that you would want them doing is getting basic words wrong, like efficacy. Efficacy sounds like some sort of seafood dish that's specially prepared. I'd like to get the steak with a side of efficacy, please. It sounds like it would be light, maybe with a hint of lime, but it's certainly not how you say efficacy. And I know, here's the thing. People mispronounce words. That's fine. I do it regularly here on the show. I do not, however, lead a province, and I do not purport to be an expert on the scientific method. And Don't worry, we're going to get into it in just a sec, but it's important to give Danielle Smith the opportunity to make sure that when she's talking about her understanding of science, so that I don't have to go into a remedial lesson on what the scientific method is, that was just a one-off. It's not like she doubled down on it twice, right?
And your response to the remarks from the large medical associations in our province and our country, basically associations of doctors saying that you appointed anti-science people and they told the public anti-science things.
Well, anyone who doesn't think that science is a process of point counterpoint and then being able to synthesize information is somebody who doesn't believe in science. So I know there's been a narrative, and a narrative has been enforced by shouting down contrarian voices, and that's not what we're going to do. We're going to listen to every voice, and we're going to make our best assessment based on what we're seeing with the evidence, and the evidence has changed. The information that we've had over time and what we were told at the beginning is a little bit different than.
Okay, so I guess we're doing this then. Because what Danielle Smith described, not once, but twice there, is not anything close to the scientific method. At best, it might be best described as a lazy debating strategy where you do point counterpoint and then you come up with the best available idea. And that's not how any of this works at all. So to be crystal clear, there is a defined process for how science is supposed to work. And it's none of the things that Danielle Smith described there. You start with observation, or you have a question about how does the thing do. You research the topic area. You come up with a hypothesis. An example might be, hey, I wonder if ivermectin stops COVID-19. You then test with experiments or clinical trials. See, I just did it on experiments there. You then analyze the data, and then you report your conclusions. There's no give and take, tit for tat, opposing viewpoints that's happening through here. This is the process. Now, there is, to be clear, room for criticism. And this is critically important because if we take a look at what the actual literal definition of scientific method is, it's a method of procedure that has characterized natural science since the 17th century, consisting in systematic observation, measurement, experimentation, and the formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses. Criticism is the backbone of the scientific method. So, contrarian voices, 100%. There is a qualifier, though. Those contrarian voices have to be qualified. This is the whole point of having something that's called peer review. So, to go through it for the Premier of Alberta, apparently, what is peer review? Peer review is the process where experts from a specific field or discipline, experts from a specific field or discipline, not somebody who does not have expertise in that specific field or discipline, evaluate the quality of a peer's research to assess the validity, quality, and often the originality of articles for publication. It is the foundation for safeguarding the quality and integrity of scholarly research. I just want to read that last part again because it's something that Danielle Smith clearly doesn't seem to be able to wrap her head around. It is the foundation for safeguarding the quality and integrity of scholarly research. So it's not that there's no room for criticism in science or medicine. Now I'm doing it. It's not that. There's plenty of room for criticism. But the thing is, that criticism has to come from qualified, recognized places. It has to come from people who have the expertise and the knowledge to look at the thing and go, okay, so how exactly did you do your testing? How exactly did you come to your conclusions? Did you miss anything when you came to your conclusions? That is a critically important of any decent research. Quality peer review is, again, the foundation for safeguarding the quality and integrity of scholarly research. And when we're talking about things like medicine, just having an opinion simply isn't good enough. And there's a lot of people who feel like if somebody says, hey, you don't have the qualifications to weigh in with an opinion here, that somehow that's diminishing them. And it's not. And there's a very simple reason for that. One of the basic tenets of the scientific process and of peer review is that if anybody is approaching any of these areas with any kind of sincerity, with any kind of integrity, with any sense of honesty, they're showing up to get proven wrong. They're showing up hoping that the best and brightest of minds are going to take a look at what they've produced and show them where the flaws are so they can do better. And if you're not willing to do that, if you're too fragile to weather that process, then you need to go back to the grindstone and you need to get better. And when we're talking about things like medicine and engineering and any of the sciences, it's critically important that people understand that. I do not believe for one second that my opinion on cellular something should be considered when it comes to somebody who's putting forward their PhD thesis, because my knowledge of the cellular things is spectacularly limited. I don't feel like I'm less if I admit that, and nobody should. I've used this example many times on the show before, but when I have a problem with one of my vehicles, I don't go, oh, I'm a lesser person because I don't know how to fix my vehicle myself. I go, no, I've used my time and I've invested my time in other things. But fortunately, there are people who have invested their time and expertise in the things, and I can take my vehicle to them to get it fixed. Or if I wanted to have an oil pipeline, I don't know how to build an oil pipeline. I don't feel like I'm a less person for not knowing how to build an oil pipeline. It's not my field of expertise, and that's okay. But the notion that everybody should be able to get, and it's wild, it's really wild that this comes from the group that historically are the ones who make jokes about participation trophies. But the notion that anybody who thinks that they have an opinion gets to show up and dictate how the scientific process works when they're failing the most basic understanding of what that process looks like, it's ridiculous. And it sets everybody up for failure. I take comfort in knowing that there are smart people in the world who know way more about other things than I do. That's one of the things that helps me sleep at night. And the fact that Danielle Smith is presenting science as, oh, no, you have to listen to everybody's opinions. You have to listen to everybody's opinions, and then you synthesize the information and you come to your own conclusion. That's not what science is. And it should be terrifying to everybody that the Premier of Alberta seems to think that's what science is. But the one thing that's nice about all of this is that as much as the report, let's see if I can get the title right, the very, very bad report, I think we should just call it that. But let's use the proper title for the sake of argument. Alberta's COVID-19 pandemic response data review task force final report from January of 2025. The one nice thing about this is even though that report clearly didn't bother to get peer reviewed before it was published, there's a whole bunch of experts in Alberta who peer reviewed it for all Albertans. There's the Canadian Medical Association. There's the Alberta Medical Association. There's the Society of Pediatric Society. All of these people who are experts in their field have taken the time to read this dumpster fire and catch the TBDs and all of the other flawed information and say, this thing isn't worth the digital space that it's printed on. And so to those experts, thank you. Moving on from there. It's going to be a fiery show tonight. We got to talk about eye care in the province of Alberta for a second. Because there's been some developments. And it's one of those things that's small enough that it has kind of slipped through the cracks a little bit. because there was a defunding of some eye care procedures that was announced early January, and it has come into effect. And a lot of people are getting messages, they're getting emails, they're getting notifications from their optometrists saying, hey, are you a senior? Are you a vulnerable person? Yeah, you got to pay for that now. And this seems like a small thing, but it's actually a really, really important thing. And it's a really, really important thing for one very simple reason. This is something that Danielle Smith promised would never happen.
And it means that a UCP government under my leadership will not delist any medical services or prescriptions now covered by Alberta.
Well, apparently there are some exceptions like eye care, but that's not the only not great news in healthcare. I promise I have two clips that I'm going to play at the very, very end to make this worthwhile. And we think we've fixed the issue with them cutting off short. So we'll find out. It's a bit of a dirge tonight, I'm afraid. We got to talk about surgery wait lists, because as much as the UCP has been taking big laps, victory laps around the surgeries and the delay in surgeries, as of November, 80,000 people were waiting for a procedure. That is up more than 3,000 people in the last 12 months. That's not nothing. And a lot of people are trying to figure out why this is happening. And the answer might be a lot more simple than you might think. One of the things that the UCP did is they expanded significantly the use of chartered surgical facilities. Now, chartered surgical facilities is a very nice way of saying profitized healthcare. So these are privately owned, privately run surgical facilities that cherry pick the easiest procedures. They don't take the complex patients. They don't take the patients that are likely to have complicated issues. And in fact, if somebody does have an issue coming out of the surgery, they immediately bounce these patients into the public healthcare system. But one of the things that all of these chartered surgical facilities have done is they've had to hire a lot of people because the UCP expanded them so much. And the problem is, if you're a burnt out, tired healthcare worker who's been in the public system, and somebody comes to you and they say, hey, you look like you might be tired, a little frustrated working the overnight shifts. Great news. We only do 9 to 5s. We only take the easiest patients. Every day is going to be predictable. It's going to be easy. You get to go home. You get to have time for dinner. And we've got an espresso machine. What do you think? Also, we're going to pay you more because they're getting more money. There's a lot of healthcare workers who have justifiably said, I do not like working in the public healthcare system because everything is awful. And so I would like very much please to have a nice day at work. And yes, I would like an espresso. I hear Starbucks has a delightful little caramel puck thing that they've got now. Very tasty. I'd like some of that, please, and thank you. And this has caused a not insignificant brain drain that's gone on in the province of Alberta, where a lot of the people who have the skills to be working in the public system have migrated to the profitized system. Better pay, more stability, all of those things. Again, you can't give them a hard time for it, but you can criticize the fact that the UCP has allowed the expansion of these facilities and facilitated the brain drain that we're talking about here. And with that in mind, it's important to wonder about our next story, because our next story speaks to, hey, is there more going on in healthcare than maybe we're aware of? Is there going to be an expansion of profitized services? And the firewall that exists between the government and healthcare delivery in the province of Alberta, at this point, it's effectively been knocked down. Historically, you had the government of Alberta, and then they said to Alberta Health, which was different than Alberta Health Services, hey, this is the money we will give you to do the healthcare things. And Alberta Health then said to Alberta Health Services, you have this much money to go do the healthcare things. These are the things that we'd like to focus on. We're going to build a hospital. We're going to do X, Y, and Z. And then Alberta Health Services was responsible for making all of those healthcare things happen. And one of the things that was really important about that is it allowed some autonomy within the healthcare system, within Alberta Health Services, to make sure that government wasn't reaching in and messing around. Well, when Danielle Smith got elected, she said that she wanted to be able to reach directly into the healthcare system. She fired the AHS board. She put in a executive director and administrator, an executive administrator, and then rebuilt the board. Well, that was until this week, because this week, Danielle Smith once again fired the entire AHS board. And the reasons should give everybody pause from the story by Jason Markisoft. In a written statement, her office suggested the board's termination was to give government oversight of AHS, which is, again, supposed to be an arm's length agency. From the statement, this is a critical time in our refocusing efforts as AHS continues to transition to a hospital-based service delivery provider. So it is essential that we remain extremely nimble in addressing any issues that arise, the health minister's office stated. We believe that this is the best achieved by increasing government oversight and involvement in the winding up of AHS as a regional health authority and overseeing its final transition to a service provider. So let's be very, very clear here. When we go back to Danielle Smith's comments and Danielle Smith's vision for healthcare, she's been very, very clear. She doesn't think that AHS should be the ones doing the administration of healthcare. They should just be a single service provider. And Danielle Smith was also very clear on multiple occasions that the reason why she believed that was so important was because if they're just a service provider and we don't like what they're doing, then what we can do, you see, is we can just reach in and we can take them away. And maybe we can give that hospital that they were running to a private company. We could give it to Bob's hospital company. We could give it to Jim's hospital company, Sam's hospital company. Who knows? There's all kinds of different hospital companies that we could possibly give it to. And then we could see if they're able to accomplish the things that we want them to accomplish. Raises a lot of questions. And this came out in a letter that was released. And this is where the structuring gets to be so important, because from the letter that was sent to everybody and their dog, as official administrator alongside my duties as Deputy Minister of Health and interim president and CEO of Alberta Health Services, I will oversee the successful completion of the systems refocusing initiative while also ensuring that the agency's seamless transition to an acute care service provider and hospital operator. So that is from Andre Tremblay, who is the interim AHS president. He's also the interim AHS CEO. Oh, and he's the deputy minister of health as well. So any firewalls that may have existed have been completely removed at this point, because Danielle Smith can say to Adriana LaGrange, hey, I let you go to the prayer breakfast. More on that later. I let you go to the prayer breakfast. I'd like you to kind of make these changes to AHS. Adriana LaGrange can then say to her deputy minister, who happens to be the guy who's responsible for making everything happen at Alberta Health Services, I'd like you to do these things, please. And will they get done? Or will Danielle Smith fire another person? Lots of questions. Moving on from there, we got to talk about the little guy for a second. We got to talk about Dale Nally. Dale Nally is the Minister of Red Tape Reduction, and I'm not wearing a damn mask at the hockey game. We haven't forgotten Dale. He had an announcement this week about a couple of different things, but one of the things that came up was gambling.
I'm just hoping you can give us an update on the changes to online gaming and potentially bringing, like Bet365 and Bodog under the Alberta legislative sphere. You know what I mean?
Sure. I wish I could give you something concrete. I can only tell you at this point it's something that we're looking at. We have heard loud and clear from Albertans that iGaming is alive and well in Alberta, but it's unregulated and it's the Wild West. And so Albertans are saying to us, why can't you do what Ontario has done? And so we're taking a look at what Ontario has done, and they've done a great job of not just regulating it, but making it safer. Now, I want to be clear, gambling, and particularly online gambling, will never be a safe activity. But there There are ways to make it safer. There are ways to make it more responsible. Ontario has done a good job at that, and so we're currently looking at that. No decisions have been made, but we will be moving forward later on in the year with...
Now, there's a lot to unpack in that clip. We could start with the whole piece around, look, gambling's never going to be safe, y'all. We got to make sure, though, that if people do use one of their vices that could cause catastrophic effects to their lives, that they're doing so safely. We want to make sure that there's a safe supply of gambling, if you will. You can see where I'm going with this. The hypocrisy is very, very real. But we have no answers. We don't know what we're going to do, but we want to make sure there's robust supports. We haven't made any decisions, but robust supports. Well, it turns out they did make some decisions because the Alberta government has ended a funding contract for a nonprofit organization that provides education and resources for gambling addiction. From the story, Ray Reschke, executive director of the Edmonton-based Problem Gambling Resources Network, says without the funding, the organization will likely have to shut its doors. He said the network had a government funding agreement of some sort since 1993. Earlier this month, he said he was told the government was ending its 3-year contract and pulling the nearly $130,000 it provided annually. And this is something that we're seeing lots of, where the government is saying, oh, hey, we're going to do this super awesome, wonderful thing. Oh, it's going to be so good. And then turns around and with the other hand takes something away. We've seen this with the disabled community, where there's been several disabled organizations that have had their funding pulled from them. We're also seeing this in childcare because the government took a victory lap this week where they said, hey, you know what? Great news, everybody. We're expanding the childcare. Everybody and their dog. If you have the kids, $15 a day daycare. Sounds great on its face. It's supposed to be moving towards the $10 a day daycare. The problem is that they also took something away in the process. They removed the low income subsidy. And this is a big deal because as per the province's own numbers, there's approximately 70,000 kids in Alberta who received some form of subsidy. And this is critically important because this is the difference for many families between the mom or the dad being able to go to work and one of them having to stay home with the kids. With that subsidy, those parents were both able to go to work. They were both able to contribute to the economy. They were both able to earn money. With this, that potentially changes things, and it forces a lot of hardship onto parents who are already having some difficulty. Which brings us to our next one, which is complex, but not. And you'll see why I say that in just a second. So, there's a strike that's been going on for a little while now. Support workers, support staff in the Edmonton area, they served strike notice on Thursday, January 9th, 2025. And they're striking for better wages because if you take a look at what support workers are actually paid, it's not great, especially for the work that they do. Well, Demetrius Nicolaides issued a ministerial order that very, very quietly stayed under the radar. A little while ago, we got sent a copy of the order, and it's worth taking a look at what it says, because what it says is, I, Demetrius Nicolaides, Minister of Education, pursuant to Section 4 of the In-Person Learning Regulation, exempt the Board of Trustees of Edmonton School Division from the application of Section 2 of the regulation to provide an in-person learning option at the schools under its authority to students who require an educational assistant due to complex needs, where the continued attendance of those students at in-person learning may risk the health and safety of the student or other students or staff, subject to terms and conditions in the attached appendix. The order commences January 13th and expires the day after the termination of QP 3550 labor strike or upon revocation by the minister. So it's pretty clear that this order was designed to do a couple of things. One of the things that this order very, very clearly is tied up in is the strike of the support workers. The other thing that's very, very clear is that Demetrius Nicolaides didn't mind going back on one of the big promises that the UCP made. One of the big promises that the UCP made coming out of the COVID pandemic, right or wrong, was that never again in the province of Alberta would kids not be allowed to go to school. There would be nothing that would stop kids from being able to access in-person learning. This order says, well, unless they're disabled and just too much work, because we don't want to pay those support workers to come in. We don't want to pay them a fair wage to do the work that they do. So we're going to try to drive a wedge and punch down on disabled kids. Well, there's a lawsuit now. And this is an important thing to highlight here. 4 students with disabilities are suing the government of Alberta over the discriminatory and unlawful practices during the QP 3550 strike. They filed for an emergency injunction seeking a suspension of the ministerial order, which would mean that the school board was responsible for making sure that those kids have access to the support workers. From the press release, the ministerial order makes an explicit and flagrant distinction based on these students' disabilities, said Orla O'Kelly of O'Kelly Law, who is representing the students. It is because of their disabilities that they have complex needs. And it is because of these complex needs, 1,200 kids are being told to stay home from school. The Edmonton Public School Board reported that approximately 2,500 students are on modified schedules. The statement of claim alleges that the ministerial order is unlawful because it takes away the students' rights to education guaranteed in the Education Act. It also argues that the ministerial order and other government actions are discriminatory towards students with disabilities. The ministerial order gives the legal cover for schools to make children stay home because the government won't provide funding for adequate supports to these children. And this is where it gets really heavy. The students also alleged that the minister, Nicolaides, engaged in misfeasance in public office, acting for an improper purpose to save money in issuing the allegedly unlawful ministerial order. So, to make a very, very long story short, the UCP has very much gone back on its promise of, hey, you know what, we're going to make sure the kids, they're never going to have to stay home from school again. They've gone back on that promise. And it almost appears, certainly some people have made the suggestion, that Minister Nicolaides is trying to weaponize disabled kids in this whole strike issue, which is, quite frankly, unbelievably gross. Moving on from there, we got to talk about the prayer breakfasts, and this goes back to December. We apparently we caused some problems when we put this tweet out here back in December. Reading from the tweet from the DMs, wondering who the theocrats are in the UCP. Good news, they have a list, and they're going to the U.S. National Prayer Breakfast because Dan Williams did all of the networking. It includes the screen capture that we were provided by an anonymous source that very, very clearly spelled out who was invited to the National Prayer Breakfast. Hi, Minister, MLA, schedulers, and friends. I hope this email finds you well. Earlier this fall, Minister Williams was put in contact with the organizers of the U.S. National Prayer Breakfast to seek guidance and input for our own provincial Christian prayer breakfast. So let's be clear right out of the gates here. The government of Alberta is putting resources towards creating a provincial Christian prayer breakfast. In the process of this discussion, he was invited to lead an Alberta delegation to attend the United States National Prayer Breakfast, NPB, in Washington, D.C., February 5th to 6th, 2025. Minister Williams nominated each of you to be one of the Alberta invitees to this event. Those in the list below. The list below: Dan Williams, Joseph Schau, Nathan Newdorf, Nathan Cooper, Chantel DeJong, Nolan Dick, Andrew Boychenko, Julia Behrman, Pam Davidson, and Minister LaGrange may also attend on a separate invitation. Well, it turns out they're going. They went. Some of them, anyways, and some of them went on the taxpayer's dime. Affordability and Utility Minister Nathan Newdorf, Health Minister Adriana LaGrange, and Mental Health and Addiction Minister Dan Williams, along with 3 staff, are scheduled to attend the event. And apparently, from Mr. Markosoff's story, LaGrange is already on the way. So that's fun. I guess Alberta's getting a Christian National Provincial Prayer Breakfast Day because Dan Williams wants to do that. Cool. Moving on from there and into the main event. We got to talk about the Donald. You know, I love I have my concerns about the AI. I don't want to see a Skynet thing happen, but some of the graphics that the AI can cook up for us, they're a little bit fun. See, it's a bull in a china shop, but it's Donald Trump, because that's the theme that we're going to go with for the next little bit. So let's talk about the tariff situation that we've seen unfold over the last week.
If he is determined to put in a tariff to generate revenue for whatever need he has domestically, that just lowers the chance of a Team Canada success in whatever form it takes.
I don't know if it will be, because look at what just happened in the last 24 hours in Colombia. Colombia, he threatened to slap on a 25% tariff. And what did he want in return? He wanted them to agree to accept the deportees that he was sending. And when they finally agreed, he took the tariff threat off the table. So that's why I'm saying that we've got a president that we have to find out what exactly it is he's looking for from Canada. I don't know that we've gotten to that yet. I think you get there by having diplomacy and negotiation. And
So why are we playing that clip again? We played it last week. Why are we playing it a clip again? It's an important clip because Danielle Smith admits for the first time she doesn't actually know what Trump wants, which is wild, because if you take a look at what Trump's actually said over the last little bit, it's pretty clear what's going on here. We did a thought experiment at the end of last week's episode. We're not going to be doing a thought experiment this week because the pieces have all pretty much fallen into place. But let's go back to the beginning of the week, because Danielle Smith was saying, we hope we can talk him out of the tariffs, and the Donald had some thoughts.
America is going to be very rich again, and it's going to happen very quickly. It's time for the United States to return to the system that made us richer and more powerful than ever before. Do you know the United States in 1870 to 1913, all tariffs, and that was the richest period in the history of the United States, relatively speaking. In other words, relatively. And they set up the Great Tariff Commission of 1887. And this commission had one function: what to do with all the money that we took in. It was so enormous that they had no idea. It was a blue ribbon committee. It was set up 1887. And what to do with all of the money that we had. And again, Teddy Roosevelt was a beneficiary, because when McKinley was killed, he took over this vast sum of money, and he did all of those national parks and all of the other things. And I'm not knocking him, but he was given a vast amount of money, and that was all made through tariffs. We had no income tax. The income tax came in 1913. As I said in my speech last week, instead of taxing our citizens to enrich foreign nations, we should be tariffing and taxing foreign nations to enrich our citizens.
Now, it's wild that room of people clapped, because, again, remedial, for anybody who's unfamiliar, tariffs are costs that the country that's receiving the goods puts on the goods on the country's end. So you can't put a tariff on the Canada side. You can only put it on the United States side if you're the president of the United States. If you're the prime minister of Canada, as we'll see later, turns out you can put some tariffs on too. But tariffs are just, hey, we're importing this widget. I would like to charge more for this widget, so we're going to add 10% or 25% to the widget price. If you want to sell the widgets, you got to give us 25% of the value. That's what tariffs are. But there's a couple of things that are important to understand about the whole tariff conversation. The first one is you can't just do these things. There have to be emergencies. And if you view it through the lens of you need an emergency to justify putting tariffs on, all of a sudden the emergency at the border, when it comes to migrants, when it comes to the fentanyl crisis, all of a sudden, we've got us an emergency. We need to do these tariffs. But again, the end game for Donald Trump is very clearly getting the tariffs in place. It's a tremendous way to raise revenue. It's a tremendous way to stimulate internal production of the things and the stuffs. Because if you run an oil company and you want to sell oil and gas to people, you have places where you can get the oil from. You can import it fairly easily from Canada right now, or that becomes so expensive that it becomes cheaper for you to drill more in the United States. And you can apply that same model to just about any industry. If you make it prohibitively expensive to import things, then you increase the likelihood, the chances of domestic production. You bring back the jobs, as Donald Trump likes to say. It's also a hell of a way to raise additional revenue. And Donald Trump has been very, very clear that one of the things that he wants to do is a little bit of a bait and switch in order to eliminate income tax. So instead of charging people income tax, if the tariffs generate enough money, then he can stop charging people income tax. Look, he's the president who got rid of income tax. Life's more expensive on everything that's imported, but the people go, but I don't have to pay the income tax anymore. For lower income and middle income people, it's a bit of a trade-off. And the instability that's caused by it, by the tariffs, is actually probably worse. But for the uber wealthy, for the super rich, for the broligarchs, for all the ones who are sitting in the front row of Donald Trump's inauguration, getting rid of income tax is a huge, big deal. So that's some context to think about as we go through the rest of the things. Because Donald Trump, that was him on the 27th talking about, that was at the GOP conference. He still wants his tariffs. Danielle Smith had a presser on the 29th, and she was still going out of her way to try to find ways to make the tariffs not be a thing. She still believed that if we just dealt with the border crisis, which doesn't exist, if we dealt with the border crisis in Canada, then we could get Trump there. And she had a very junta-ish idea for how we could do that.
Can Carrie go to the mic?
I'm good here. I'm just give you away.
Okay. Well, I think we record it, so I think if you wouldn't mind going to the mic. It's just right 2 steps in front of you.
Who would you suggest should be the board of czar?
A general. Whoever it is, we've got lots of retired generals. I had a former retired general be my deputy minister, Paul Winnick. I've volunteered his name up, but that's who I think it should be to show that we're serious.
You have volunteered, Paul?
I volunteered his name.
Just now, or you have?
No, I did it in front of Jonathan Wilkinson while he was sitting right there. My DM, of course, as you know, is leaving to join APEGA. I don't know if he'll take him up, but that's the kind of person that we need. Someone who understands military operations, who understands deployment, who understands the seriousness with which we have to take this issue. So I don't know who the federal government has in mind, but that's the kind of person that we need.
How was your suggestion received by the federal government?
You'll have to ask them. I think that what the issue that we have right now is that we have some turmoil in politics at the moment. We have a voice at the table, Dominic LeBlanc, who I think is a consistent voice. He's developing the relationships, but we're going to see within 39 days, I think, a change in Prime Minister. And then after that, there may be another change in Prime Minister. I think that's why it needs to have an independent person who, with any luck, would be able to withstand changes of government so that we are able to seamlessly ensure that we can work with the Americans on this.
Do you think Trudeau should be
Thanks, Carrie. We're
Such a professional environment going on there. So yeah, Danielle Smith pitching the idea that we should have independent military policing the border, because putting the military in charge of domestic stuffs, nothing's ever gone wrong there. It has often very, very, very bad. Especially given the argument that she would want that individual to be independent enough that they would be able to survive not one, but 2 potential changes in prime minister and government. That's problematic, because when you have the military on the border doing the border things and they're not responsible to anyone, That's not great. When the argument is, but I know the guy, he and I go way back, that's even less not great. But that wasn't the end of Danielle Smith's military aspirations for the week. She also she pitched a military base. In a Thursday statement, Smith said she pitched the idea at a meeting on Wednesday with fellow premiers and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to further bolster Canadian-U.S. Arctic security. I asked my provincial and federal counterparts in the First Minister's meeting to consider establishing a joint Canada-U.S. NORAD region base in northern Canada, similar to Canadian NORAD headquarters in Winnipeg, Manitoba. So let's just back it up again. We have a president of the United States who has said that he wants to make Canada the 51st state. And Danielle Smith's response is, well, what if we opened up a military base that the United States could be in part based out of here in Alberta, northern Alberta? What could go wrong? It's pretty wild. But that wasn't the only thing. Again, there's so much that happened this week. We also finally saw the order in council drop. And this is the order in council that, again, gets to some complicated places, because this is the order in council that sees the 2-kilometer border area prescribed as essential infrastructure. So this is the change to the rules that the UCP said they were going to make using the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act. And what this does, no exaggeration, no joke, is this creates for the province of Alberta with no prescribed endpoint. I think that's important to take a note of. There's no expiry clause on this here. And what this does is this says within 2 kilometers of the Canadian border, the Canadian-U.S. border, that is now all considered to be critical infrastructure. And that means anybody can be detained, anybody can be arrested, anybody can be searched. There's no cause that's required, which is pretty wild, because it's now an area where the Alberta police force, cough the sheriff's cough, we're going to get to that in just a sec, have the ability to do pretty much whatever they want, as long as they believe that it's in the course of patrolling. They have, in effect, taken over 2 kilometers of land along the entire border. And there's a lot of people that would say, oh, but that's not a bad thing. We need to do that because we have to secure the border because there's all of these border problems. And again, in Alberta, there's really not. But Danielle Smith nonetheless tweeted out on the 30th, we're getting closer and closer to D-Day here, Alberta is serious when it comes to border security. We're taking action to crack down on fentanyl tracking and illegal migration with real action, which again, not a big thing. Our new interdiction patrol team, IPT, is now on the ground along the Canada-U.S. border by adding 51 Alberta sheriffs, 4 patrol dogs ready to track and take down threats. 10 cold weather drones for 24/7 surveillance, 4 narcotic analyzers to detect and stop deadly drugs in their tracks, and more tools to help keep Albertans safe. And then she had some pictures. And we got to talk about what's going on in some of these pictures for a sec, because these are supposed to be the elite Alberta sheriffs, the interdiction patrol team. They're the Alberta sheriffs of the IPT. So you have to wonder why is it that some of these folks who are doing the sheriffy stuff have fish and wildlife. We have a fish and wildlife sheriff here operating one of the drone controls. We also have corrections. So these are sheriffs who work in prisons who are doing the dog searches. So it seems like, in many ways, what Danielle Smith has done is she's pulled in a bunch of resources from existing law enforcement. These aren't new. She's pulled in a bunch of resources from existing law enforcement. And what she's tried to do is make it look like all of these resources are in place. But there's a lot of questions about, okay, so if those are corrections dogs, then they're not sheriff's dogs. And what's going, where are the dogs supposed to be? But one of the other things that comes into play is that Fish and Wildlife sheriff who's operating the drone, there's some questions that came up because it didn't take very long before we had a couple of folks that were able to identify the type of drone that we're talking about here. There's a very clear picture of it. And it's not very difficult to match that picture to the Matrix 30T Public Safety Agency kit. Now, this kit starts at $18,000 as the base price. If you want any of the bells and whistles, which apparently they got a couple of, we're talking at upwards $20,000 per drone. Now, apparently, from the Premier's tweet, they bought 10 of these drones. So we have spent $200,000 of taxpayers' money on 10 drones. Now, where it gets to be even more interesting is the questions in regards to the drones. So at first glance, when you take a look at the specs for the drones, it's pretty impressive. It flies at a max speed of 82 kilometers per hour. It has a flight time of 41 minutes. And that means that on a perfect windless day, it can travel for about 40 kilometers for 20 minutes before it has to turn back around and come to base. Now, its maximum range, though, is only 7 to 8 kilometers. And that's with all of the maximum toys and the boosters and all of that stuff on a clear day with no interference. So you can fly around in a 7 to 8 kilometer circle for 41 minutes, but that's all that you can do. And that is under the best case circumstances, because when you start to run into weather, those numbers can be easily cut in half, which means you're now looking at 10 minutes before you have to turn around. And where it gets really wild with these drones is that they're only good to minus 20. So as soon as it starts below minus 20, which never ever happens in southern Alberta, then you start to lose a lot of efficiency, a lot of range, all of the things. So it looks like taxpayers spent upwards of $200,000 for these drones. And where it gets really nuts, the manufacturers of these drones is a company called DJI. Now, they have offices all around the world, but they are a Chinese company, and they are one of the Chinese companies that the United States has said that they're looking at banning domestically. They want to say that nobody can fly these drones, any Chinese owned or manufactured drones, for security reasons. And that's what we've chosen to deploy to the border. So it appears that we've taken a technology that the United States has already said they don't trust, and that's what we spent $200,000 deploying to the border. Cool. Also on January 31st, we saw a survey come out of business leaders. And this is actually a pretty big deal because the business leaders, this was a survey that was done of Alberta businesses. 96% of Alberta business leaders say that Canada must retaliate on U.S. tariffs. Now, the reason why this survey is so important is because these are the people who are going to be most affected by tariffs. Both ways. And if Canada retaliates with tariffs, these are the people that would also be affected. So to have 96% of Alberta business leaders say we have to do some retaliation is not insignificant. It's actually really, really quite important, because one of the things that you have to be willing to ask yourself is, when every other premier is saying we have to do retaliatory something, we have to retaliate, we can't just sit back and go, oh, but we'll try harder, Donald, to address the pretexts that you need to keep in place in order to have your tariffs, which you've said you want. So, but we promise we'll try really, really hard to take away your reasons for having the things that you want, and also entirely ignoring the fact that the Donald has said that he wants Canada to be the 51st state. That's not nothing. He's also said that he's willing to use economic force to make that happen. That's not nothing. So when almost everybody who's on the playing field is saying we have to retaliate, it's worth asking the question, why did it take Danielle Smith so long to get there? To her credit, she's now saying, yeah, maybe we have to do some retaliation. But it took her a really, really long time to get there. So, A, she's clearly wrong. She clearly read the room wrong. And B, she's clearly not the great strategist that so many people are holding her up to be. And speaking of reading the room wrong, that brings us to Friday. Because on Friday, we're getting close to D-Day, and there was this one singular report that was circulating that suggested that maybe the tariffs weren't going to be a thing. And it didn't take very long for the Danielle Smith fans, the stands, the Danistans, I don't know, to try to chalk this up to the win column. There's a gentleman named Mark Slipinski. I'm not making that up. His name's Mark Slipinski, and he loves to say wonderful things about Danielle Smith. It's almost as if I've heard some people suggest that he's getting paid to do so. I have no idea if that's true or not, but he really likes to carry water for the Smith. And at 10:30 in the morning, he tweeted out, breaking, Donald Trump has given Canada another extension on tariffs. These tariffs will not begin February 1st, rather March 1st. This is due to diplomacy by Danielle Smith, as I previously reported. This Fox News special is what changed Trump's mind. Watch it. Well, it didn't take very long before a response came in.
I was just with the president in the Oval Office, and I can confirm that tomorrow, the February 1st deadline that President Trump put into place at a statement several weeks ago continues. The president will be implementing tomorrow a 25% tariffs on Mexico, 25% tariffs on Canada, and a 10% tariff on China for the illegal fentanyl that they have sourced and allowed to distribute into our country, which has killed tens of millions of Americans. These are promises made and promises kept by the president.
The president yesterday said that last night he was planning to discuss whether an exemption would be made on oil imports. Do you have any information on what decision he made there, or will there be exemptions at all offered under this?
I don't have an update or readout for you on the exemptions, but those tariffs will be for public consumption in about 24 hours.
That didn't age well, did it? Couple of hours, and all of a sudden, all of the people who were willing to declare Danielle Smith the diplomatic leader of the world had to eat a little bit of crow. But to Mark's credit, he's not the only person who maybe has read the room a little bit wrong. And this is where we have to take a sec to talk about I don't know what to call them. They go by the name Rebel News. And they like to say they do news, which is complicated because the main guy behind Rebel News is a guy named Ezra Levant. He got sued a few years back, and he was very, very clear that he's not a journalist. He's an entertainer. He does infotainment. But they still call themselves Rebel News. And we wanted to take a second to look at how Rebel News has chosen to respond to the existential threat that Donald Trump has levied towards Canada. So to be clear, to be very, very clear, so there's no mistakes, Donald Trump has said he's going to put tariffs on Canada's products because of the things that don't happen, and at least not very much. And he's going to try to take over Canada using economic force. How does Rebel News respond? They put some merch up. The first picture comes from January 31st. This is quite literally the day before the tariffs were set to drop. I stand with Trump. You can buy an I stand with Trump mug. Show your unwavering support for the man who refuses to back down. And just so I don't know if I could put too fine of a point on this. This is coming from the Rebel News Canada social media account on the Twitter machine. Not to be outdone, though. On the day that the tariffs dropped, February 1st, 2025, they got t-shirts now. And the t-shirts have Donald Trump, post-assassination attempt, holding his fist up defiantly, undefeated, with a very intimidating American flag background. Undefeated. Show your unwavering support for the man who refuses to back down. From Rebel News Canada. So with that in mind, we wanted to humbly make a suggestion. Since Rebel News is they've stopped saying, they're just going to say the quiet part out loud now. We thought maybe it was time to update their logo to something a little bit more fitting, to something that perhaps represents their ethos a little bit better. I don't know. But Danielle Smith, on the morning of the dropping of the tariffs, released a statement. I'm disappointed with U.S. President Trump's decision to place tariffs on all Canadian goods. This decision will harm Canadians and Americans alike and strain the important relationship and alliance between our two nations. Alberta will do everything in its power to convince the U.S. President and Congress, as well as the American people, to reverse this mutually destructive policy. And then this is where it gets weird. We note the reduced 10% tariff for Canadian energy. This is a partial recognition of the advocacy undertaken by our government and industry to the U.S. administration. Is it, though? Is it? Is it a recognition? Is this a victory lap? Or is this just the U.S. saying it's going to take us some time to ramp up our domestic production? So we're going to go a little bit easier on the gas stuff, because those are the things that are really going to make people crazy, because they got to refill their cars all the time. We've pointed out the substantial wealth, and they missed a space in the statement, which is fun, created by the U.S. by American companies and tens of thousands of American workers who upgrade and refine approximately $100 billion of Canadian crude into $300 billion of products sold all over the world by those same U.S. companies. And then again, we go to the same argument that we've heard over and over and over again. It is also worth noting that if oil and gas exports are excluded, the United States actually sells more to Canada than Canada sells to the U.S. As I've stated to every American policymaker I've met with these past months, Canada buys more from the U.S. than does any country on earth, more than the U.K., France, Germany, Italy, and Vietnam combined. It is therefore no economic justification for tariffs imposed on any Canadian goods. That's assuming, and it's important to highlight this, that's assuming that the only justification for the tariffs is the one piece of that we hear Donald Trump reiterating, it's because there's this trade imbalance. If we remove the biggest thing from the trade imbalance, then there's not actually a trade imbalance, right? So that's cool. It's a fascinating argument to make. And again, Danielle Smith doubles down. Alberta will, however, continue to strenuously oppose any effort to ban exports to the U.S. or to tax our own people and businesses on goods leaving Canada for the United States. Such tactics would hurt Canadians far more than Americans. So despite the fact that 96% of business leaders in Alberta said there have to be retaliatory actions, Danielle Smith, in her statement, says, but what if we didn't do anything? We will also continue Alberta's call for an appointment of a border czar to coordinate the securing of our border against illegal migrants and drugs moving in both directions, and to achieve our nation's 2% GDP NATO commitment by 2027. These things should be done for the safety of all Canadians, regardless of our trade dispute with the United States. So Danielle Smith is making the argument here, even if there's no trade dispute with the United States, we should still put the military, we should have a general in charge of the border. It's just wild. And it's important to take into consideration. You've seen this graphic floating around, perhaps, but it shows, and I want to be really, really clear here. This is not, in showing this graphic, this is not a way to say, but Mexico's the problem. That's not the point at all. The reality is there are no countries north of Canada. There are a lot of countries south of Mexico. So to compare apples and oranges isn't right. And I don't want to say, Mexico's just the worst. That's absolutely not what I'm saying here, okay? But if we're going to define the scope of the problem, taking a look at the northern border versus the southern border illustrates very clearly that this is the motivation for doing these things, for these the tariffs, is not because the drugs and the migrants. That's just the pretense that's been used to put the tariffs in place. And the fact that Danielle Smith and so many other political leaders have not been able to wrap their head around this very basic fact that there's a very different end game being played is really, really quite alarming. Which brings us to last night.
Tonight, I am announcing Canada will be responding to the U.S. trade action with 25% tariffs against $155 billion worth of American goods. This will include immediate tariffs on $30 billion worth of goods as of Tuesday, followed by further tariffs on $125 billion worth of American products in 21 days' time to allow Canadian companies and supply chains to seek to find alternatives. Like the American tariffs, our response will also be far-reaching and include everyday items such as American beer, wine, and bourbon, fruits and fruit juices, including orange juice, along with vegetables, perfume, clothing, and shoes. It'll include major consumer products like household appliances, furniture, and sports equipment, and materials like lumber and plastics, along with much, much more. And as part of our response, we are considering, with the provinces and territories, several non-tariff measures, including some relating to critical minerals, energy, procurement, and other partnerships. We will.
Now, you can dislike Justin Trudeau as much as you like. That's okay. But the universal consensus across the country, with the exception of some folks who are going to be some folks, is that that was one of the most powerful speeches. That was just a clip from the speech, but that was one of the most powerful speeches delivered by a prime minister in living memory. And it was a very, very powerful speech for a lot of different reasons. But one of the other things that came out of the speech is there were some very important questions that were asked. And it's important to highlight again what the context of these questions were. So going back to the first minister's meeting that happened several weeks ago, where the first ministers signed a statement, they said there's going to be a wide range of options that were going to be considered. They said all options were on the table. And then they said there was one province that refused to get on board with Team Canada and refused to sign the statement. Danielle Smith did not sign the statement. Now, inside of that statement, it was very, very clear. If there were any industries that were negatively affected by this trade war, any monies that were raised from any retaliatory actions would go to support those industries. The statement was very, very clear at the time. Nobody was going to get singled out. Nobody was going to get left behind. But Danielle Smith and the UCP did a very, very good job of weaponizing that statement and weaponizing that moment, saying that they wouldn't sign on because they would not allow Alberta Oil and Gas to be the sole bearer of the burden. And this question came up again.
Prime Minister, you said earlier that you're not going to move forward on measures that would further divide the country. Does this mean that blocking energy exports is fully off the table?
It means that any conversations around further measures, particularly involving one industry or one region of the country more than another, is something that we're going to do carefully and thoughtfully and with the full partnership of regional leaders, provincial premiers, businesses. No one part of the country should be carrying a heavier burden than any other. We're in this together. We're all going to stand together and we'll be there for each other.
Which was a really good answer. And it was a really good answer for a bunch of different reasons. One of them was he did not say those options were off the table. He was very clear about the fact that those options were, in fact, still on the table, but that no decisions would be made without a collaborative approach that didn't see anybody left behind. And that's really, really important. There's another question that he was asked that was also really, really important.
You're dealing with the U.S. administration that says, there's nothing that you can do to stop this. We're not looking for any concessions. So do you see any conceivable way out of this because of that?
The coming weeks will be difficult for Canadians, and they'll be difficult for Americans. The level of cooperation, the level of effective partnerships between our two countries that have been established over decades and generations means that this trade action by the Americans and our response is going to have real consequences for people, for workers on both sides of our border. We don't want to be here. We didn't ask for this. But we will not back down in standing up both for Canadians and for the incredible, successful relationship and partnership.
It's a pretty powerful answer to a very real question. Donald Trump has said a lot of things. One of the things that he said is that there's nothing that Canada can do to stop the tariffs. He's also said that he wants Canada to be a 51st state. He's also said that he will take over Canada using economic force. So Donald Trump has said a lot of bombastic things. Now, that's one of the things that Donald Trump does. But here's the question that I think that people really should take some time to wrestle with. Danielle Smith fancies herself to be, and certainly, pardon me, certainly Danielle Smith likes to present herself as being the great diplomat. Her team, whether we're talking about the literal staffers or we're talking about the various conservative social media pundits, they all want to cast Danielle Smith as being the diplomatic adult voice, getting results, getting things done. It is telling what the motivation is when you look at a couple of very basic things. Since Danielle Smith got into office, she has, in every way imaginable, fueled, if not instigated, a combative and inflammatory approach with the federal government. There's a real win that Danielle Smith could be claiming in this situation. Think about the clip that we played in the middle there, where Justin Trudeau said, you know what? I'm not going to say whether or not anything's off the table. Well, we got all the options, but we're not going to be doing anything without a collaborative approach. We're not going to be doing anything without making sure that the people and regions most affected are taken care of. If Danielle Smith truly wanted to define herself as the great mediator, the great diplomat, instead of chasing her tail with Donald Trump, she would do very well to say, look, I brought Trudeau to heel. That first minister's meeting, boy, let me tell you, they wanted to come after the oil and gas. They sure wanted to, but I used diplomacy with Justin Trudeau. I showed up to the meetings, even from bed some days maybe, and I made sure that he understood, and I made him listen. And look, he listened. It's not going to be anything done unless Alberta agrees to it. So, one for us. You're welcome. She could have very easily done that. But what was Danielle Smith's first public response after Justin Trudeau announced that Canada was going to be pursuing tariffs? Well, it came the next morning. And it was a quote not from Justin Trudeau. No. It was a quote from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The president at real Donald Trump. And again, she tagged him. It's just exhausting. The president at real Donald Trump is right to focus on major problems like our broken border and the scourge of fentanyl, but the imposition of tariffs under IEEPA, which is the act, is unprecedented. Won't solve these problems and will only raise prices for American families and upend supply chains. Now, again, I go to the graph that shows the broken border, the broken Canadian border. and the scourge of fentanyl crossing the border. And again, I've said this before, I will say it again. I am not in any way trying to minimize the horrific effect that fentanyl has on people and that the ongoing opioid crisis has on people. I am not trying to minimize that. But if we're going to talk about a problem that we have, we need to talk about what's actually going on. And the reality is the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of fentanyl that exists in Canada is produced domestically. The vast majority of fentanyl that exists in the United States is produced domestically. One of the reasons that fentanyl took off in the way that it did is because if you wanted to do heroin, you needed to have access to opium, the poppy. Fentanyl synthetic. You can make it in a lab. And yes, there are very real questions to be had about the precursor chemicals and how they get into the respective countries. But the reality is, and law enforcement has been clear on this, the vast majority of fentanyl that is being used in Canada is produced domestically. So I find myself in the very strange position where I wish there was a little bit of Jason Kenney in the room right now, because one of the things that Jason Kenney was very, very good at doing was rejecting the premise. And if there was ever a premise to be rejected, it is that our border is broken. But that is exactly what Danielle Smith leaned into in her first comment. And you have to wonder, if you're so inclined, why it is that Danielle Smith and the UCP have taken the position of acquiescence. And there's a lot of different theories out there. There's a lot of different ideas. I mean, certainly Donald Trump has been very, very clear that he wants Canada to be the 51st state. Certainly, there's a strategic argument to be made for using Alberta as a wedge. All of that is true. But two things can be true at the same time. And one of the things that I think is worth remembering is that people see in others what they see in themselves. Danielle Smith has made it very, very clear throughout her political and professional career that she will abandon everything else to go to the winning side. She did it with a Wild Rose when she crossed to the PCs. And it cost her. She didn't learn a lesson because she did it again with the convoy. When the convoy presented itself, when the freedom movement presented himself, Smith did a very good job of aggressively aligning herself with the conspiracy theorists. And there are real questions to be asked in regards to how much Danielle Smith believes of those things. No one will ever know, likely, except Danielle Smith, because Danielle Smith is so good at speaking to whatever audience she's in front of, changing her message for whatever audience she's in front of. But you have to wonder, what is it that Danielle Smith sees in Donald Trump that has made her so terrified and so convinced that the only option that she can pursue is appeasement? And again, she's on her own in that stance. When we take a look at what other premiers have said, Doug Ford has initiated, and I don't like saying nice things about Doug Ford, don't get me wrong, but when somebody does something right, you got to give him props for it. Doug Ford has initiated his own provincial pieces. Every year, LCBO sells nearly $1 billion worth of American wine, beer, spirits, and seltzers. Not anymore. Starting Tuesday, we're removing American products from LCBO shelves. As the only wholesaler of alcohol in the province, LCBO will also remove American products from its catalog, so other Ontario-based restaurants and retailers can't order or restock U.S. province. There's never been a better time to choose an amazing Ontario-made or Canadian-made product. As always, please drink responsibly. David Eby also. If America thinks tariffs will crush the resolve of Canadians, they're wrong. We will not roll over. BC is stepping up to do our part by pulling U.S. liquor off the shelves, excluding U.S. products from government purchases. So other provincial leaders, and there's lots of other examples, even the nicest man in politics, Wild Canoe, put out on a personal level, if you want to find ways to fight back, shop local and buy Canadian. Where you spend your money, those are some of the most important decisions that you can make. These are premiers from across the political spectrum. Everybody is saying, we need to do more. We need to fight back. We need to send the message that we're not just going to roll over. And yet, how does Danielle Smith respond? She spends 3 of her ministers and 3 of her staffers to go to the American prayer breakfast to, again, try to get an audience with the great King President. It's absolutely beyond understanding. And the fear that I have as an Albertan is Danielle Smith will always go to what she sees to be the winning position at the detriment of everybody else around her. And she's not aligning herself with Team Canada in any meaningful way. All language is hedged. And it's all predicated on that, well, if we just fix the border, maybe he'll like me. And it starts to be important to start asking the question, does she not think that Canada can win? Does she not think that Canada can weather this? Because I'll be honest, I do. I absolutely look at the response that we've seen, not just across the province, not just across the country, but across the province as well. People are pulling together in a way that I can't remember seeing in my lifetime. And it's amazing and it's inspiring. And it's something that all true Canadians should be leaning into instead of trying to negate, instead of trying to play craven politics. There's a time and place for craven politics. No questions asked. There's a time and place to put the metaphorical knuckle dusters on. But this isn't it. This is a time and an opportunity to pull together as Canadians and address what is a very real existential threat to our country. Because Donald Trump has made it very, very clear. He has no intentions of stopping once the border's secure. And he has no intentions of stopping once the migrants start coming in from Canada. That's not his end game here. He's got a much different end game. And it's one that all Canadians should certainly be thinking about. His response. This is from this morning. We pay hundreds of billions of dollars to subsidize Canada. Why? There's no reason. We don't need anything we have. We have unlimited energy, should make our own cars, and have more lumber than we can ever use. Without this massive subsidy, Canada ceases to exist as a viable country. Harsh but true. Therefore, Canada should become our cherished 51st state. Much lower taxes, far better military protection for the people of Canada, and no tariffs. Now, there's an inherent contradiction in there. Because if Canada is worthless and we don't have anything that he needs, why would he want us to be the 51st state? With Donald Trump, it's always worth keeping in mind. He fancies himself to be a master negotiator. And at the end of the day, he's really just a bully. And there's only one way to deal with a bully when he's up in your face. That's to punch him right in the nose. That's all we've got for tonight. I think I might have angered the Elon because it looks like the Twitter space has crashed. We are working on coming up with another way to get the back and forth, the call in going, because I missed that, and it's very difficult to make it happen when Twitter X has gotten so horribly unreliable. So we're going to wrap things up for tonight there. I'm going to do a couple of the plugs, and then that'll be it. First thing I want to plug is I know we haven't been doing publicly very many interview episodes. That's not because we're not doing interviews. We are working on a project that is, as I've said before, the most ambitious thing that I think the show's ever done. And and it is going to hopefully be one of the most comprehensive looks at the coal mine situation, because the coal stuff that's going on in Alberta, it's not great. It's very bad, in fact, catastrophic, some might say. And it's not just Grassy Mountain. There's no question that Grassy Mountain is the pointy tip of the spear, but the changes that the UCP have made have potentially opened up coal mining all up and down the eastern slopes. And when we're talking about the eastern slopes, that's literally all the mountains in Alberta. So it's not great. It is an important conversation. It is a complex conversation, and it is a profoundly nuanced conversation, which is why we're taking as much time as we are to put it together. That is a conversation that we're going to be bringing you at the beginning of March. It's going to be in a format that's going to be a little bit different, so bear with us. It's going to be good, though. So if you're wondering why there are any interview episodes, that's why. We do have a couple other FOIP irons in the fire, and we're looking forward to bringing those results forward as soon as we get them. And that's it. That's the story. So here's the plugs. We do have our merch, and our merch is, for the record, if you go to the folks at abpoly.ca, they've put up a very good statement about the sourcing of all of the merch, the design of the merch, the procurement of the merch, all of that, and how it is as Canadian as absolutely possible. So we do have the mugs, we do have the hoodies, we do have the t-shirts, we do have my favorite, the beanie, or the toque, as I like to call it. But some people call them beanies. I don't know why. I don't call them toques. You know why? Because I'm Canadian. We have all of that available at abpoly.ca. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here at The Breakdown, we would love nothing more than if you signed up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/TheBreakdownAB, or for the cost of a fancy cup of coffee, maybe a little bit less than a fancy cup of coffee in the coming weeks, you can help us continue to produce the kind of content that we do. It's because of the support that we get from our Patreon supporters that we're able to cover the bills and do all of the things that we do. If you're not into long-term commitments, though, we do also have the option to e-transfer. You can send e-transfers to info@thebreakdownab.ca. All of this will be in the show notes, and that's all of the things. The one other thing I have to mention is that we are keeping up and running the legal fund. That's the response to the $6 million lawsuit that we're being sued for, because we talked about the procurement of PPE, personal protective equipment, and children's medication. So if you want to help us fight back against that, you can do that at www.savethebreakdownab.ca. And that's all of it. I want to thank everybody who tuned in tonight to listen. I want to say especially the chat was super active tonight. I love it. So good to see everybody. I've seen some new names in here, which is actually also super cool. So thank you all so much for being here, for engaging, and all of that. It's absolutely fantastic, and it means the world to me. I've said it before, and I'm going to say it every time I do the show. One of my favorite things is to read the chat while we do the downloading and all of the things, so that we can put the show up as the audio podcast and everything else. So huge thanks to the chat. If you're listening to the audio version, or if you're watching on YouTube, the subscribe button and then the little bell thing, because we do the YouTube shorts too, where you get the little short, the hits, the small doses of the breakdown in manageable levels. If you hit the little subscribe button, you'll get notified when we do that stuff. So thank you there. Listening to the audio version of the podcast, leave a review. Every little bit helps. And now, because I promised, I saved it to the very last, I have two very special clips that I want to play. Damn things on a lighter note. Let's do the first one.
The efficacy of masks and the efficacy.
I just love the efficacy. It sounds like something that should be done on a skillet. Like you get a nice, you got to get the sauté for the efficacy. You want to make sure that the efficacy is cooked properly, because there's nothing worse than undercooked efficacy. And to finish it up, the clip.
How's your BS detector evolved over time?
I tend to be pretty trusting.
I will never, ever, ever get tired of that second nod. It's just, it's never going to get old. We'll get a new premiere and I'll still be playing that clip and everybody will be going, Nate, what the hell are you doing? I want to say thank you to everybody again one more time. There's no question that the coming weeks and probably months are going to be challenging. And I want to say, especially, we're good at keeping an eye out for each other. But let's make sure that we're keeping an eye out for the people who are going to be most hit by this, because as we start to see increasing grocery prices, the more vulnerable Albertans, the more vulnerable Canadians are going to need extra support. So keep an eye out on your neighbors, and be kind. It's not that hard. It's much easier than being premier, I imagine. That's it for all. Thanks, everybody. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you next week. And as always, keep the conversation going.